Thank you so much and welcome from the break. We hope you enjoyed those mouth-watering donuts and refreshments sponsored by Hollid and the mindfulness session by Liberty. We hope you also had an opportunity to look at Insight ASA Chess semi-final.
Welcome to our first concurrent sessions. We will be doing a Q&A after each presentation. Preference will be given to the in-person questions, and a staff member will bring you a microphone. Our virtual attendees can also pose questions on the app, and we'll pose them to the speaker if there's sufficient time. If your question is not asked, then please feel free to reach out to the speakers via the connection function on the app.
We now move on to the next presentation on epigenetics, the hidden key to understanding health and insurance risk. To give this presentation, please help me welcome with your most enthusiastic applause to the stage CHRISTELLE, OOSTHUIZEN and POONAM VALA.
We're going to start with a disclaimer that epigenetics is an emerging science and epigenetic tests are an emerging technology. So the presentation today is really to introduce the concept of epigenetics and paint what a future scenario could look like in the insurance industry. Both CHRISTELLE and I are not clinical at all. We have zero clinical expertise. So we've relied on input from two doctors who consult at Insight, Dr. Gary Cantor and Dr. Liesel van Deventer, who gave us significant input in the development of this presentation.
Okay. The year is 1944. It's the end of the Second World War. The Nazis cut off food supply to the western part of the Netherlands in retaliation for the exiled Dutch government supporting the Allies. In addition to an exceptionally harsh winter, bad crops, and 4 years of brutal war, the population was forced to live on rations of about 400 to 800 calories a day. And just to put this in a bit of context, adults need about 2,000 calories a day to survive, and toddlers need about 1,000 to 1,400 calories a day. So 400 to 800 calories a day is severely limiting. This is referred to as the Dutch hunger winter and has proved unique in unexpected ways. Because it started and ended so abruptly, it served as an unplanned experiment in human health. Pregnant women, it turns out, were uniquely affected, and the children they gave birth to have been affected by the famine throughout their lives. When they became adults, they experienced higher rates of LDL cholesterol and higher levels of conditions such as schizophrenia, obesity, and diabetes. This made me wonder, what if there is some sort of test that these people could take that could tell them what impact their behaviors and environment has had on their lives so far? A test that could tell them what steps they can take to reduce to an extent or reverse some of the negative impacts of the in utero malnutrition. Would they actually make use of this information to counteract the negative impact? In today's presentation, we are going to give you a brief overview of what epigenetics is, how it can be implemented in the life insurance and healthcare industry in South Africa, as well as what some of the ethical, legal, and social implications, as well as concerns and constraints are when implementing it in insurance.
So what is epigenetics? To understand epigenetics, we first need to understand what genetics is. When we speak about genetics, we're referring to our DNA. And this is made up of tiny molecules, A, G, C's, and T's. And it's the specific arrangement of these molecules that's interpreted as our genes or our genome. Epigenetics refers to the tiny layer of molecules that sits on top of our DNA. And this regulates the way in which our genes are expressed, either by increasing, decreasing, or even deactivating a gene's expression. Your DNA remains constant throughout your life, and epigenetic changes do not alter your DNA sequence. However, epigenetic changes are more flexible and dynamic and can, in fact, be reversible. Let's start with a simple example. Let's pretend like the letters on the screen represent a sequence in your genome. When arranged in a specific way, you can interpret them as words. When given specific grammar and context, they take on a very clear meaning. However, these exact same words, when given different grammar, take on an entirely new meaning. In a similar way, epigenetics can be thought of as the grammar of our genome. So what affects our epigenetics? We know through years of scientific research that it's the diet we eat, whether it's high in sugars or unhealthy fats, the amount of physical activity we get, and the intensity of that physical activity, whether we're able to manage our stress, how much sleep we get, and the quality of that sleep, whether we smoke or drink in excess, and even how healthy our mothers were when they were pregnant with us. All of this has an impact on our epigenetics. Over and above this, the external environment can also have an impact on your epigenetics. And this is in the form of pollutants and toxins in the air or the water in the environment in which you live. Aside from lifestyle and behavioral choices, this is constrained by the commercial environment that we live in. Just think about how cheap and readily available unhealthy fast foods are relative to healthy alternatives. There are three main areas of epigenetic study. The main area of study has been around DNA methylation, and that's going to be the focus of our presentation today. So what is DNA methylation? DNA methylation refers to the grouping of chemical or methyl groups that attach on top of your DNA. And this methylation then results in negative health effects for an individual. DNA methylation can take the form of too much methylation in some places and too little methylation in other places. In fact, DNA methylation accrues with age at certain locations in your DNA, and conversely, there's a loss of methylation with age at other locations in your DNA. So by keeping track of both of these aging patterns or methylation patterns, we can come up with very accurate estimators for age and mortality risk. So two very well-published areas of study in terms of DNA methylation in relation to mortality risk are tobacco use and biological aging. Alcohol use has been investigated as well, however, not much has been published relative to tobacco use and biological aging. So when we look at DNA methylation patterns for smoking, we can see very distinct differences between people who have never smoked, former smokers, and current smokers. In addition to this, there's differences in the methylation patterns for people who have smoked 2 cigarettes a day versus people who have smoked 20 cigarettes a day. And we can also see that methylation changes in your body persist long after you stop smoking. So by using this information, we can separate the former smoking status category into 2 categories: recent quitters and long-term quitters. What's great about this is that if it's used in the underwriting process, this can actually get over the hurdle of smoker's amnesia or recall bias in the application process. So similar to smoking, alcohol use or epigenetic tests can classify applicants into 3 categories based on their alcohol use: heavy drinkers, moderate drinkers, and little to non-drinkers. DNA methylation in relation to biological aging has received a lot of focus in recent years. So every individual has 2 ages: your chronological age, which is the age you turn at every birthday, and this is something we have no control over. And then there's your biological age, and this refers to the age of the cells in your body. This is more flexible and can respond in changes to your lifestyle and health status. The way in which your biological age is estimated is through the use of epigenetic clocks. Epigenetic clocks are multivariable age estimators based on DNA methylation patterns. And in fact, an epigenetic clock can give you DNA methylation-based mortality risk score for an individual. The example we show here is where DNA methylation has been used at various sites in the DNA, including DNA methylation based on smoking pack years. And this has been used in conjunction with traditional risk factors like age and gender to predict time to death. This type of model has been shown to have better predictive value than just using normal traditional risk factors. So DNA methylation, like I mentioned earlier, has significant health effects. There's two types of abnormal DNA methylation. The first one is hypomethylation, which is too little methylation, and this can result in the activation of cancer genes that would otherwise have been silenced. So here we're switching on genes that would otherwise have been switched off. Hypermethylation refers to too much methylation. And in this scenario, you're actually silencing cancer suppressor genes. So again, switching off cancer protector genes. So both hypomethylation and hypermethylation can have negative health effects. Aside from the scenario of cancer, DNA methylation has also been investigated in relation to metabolic disease, cardiovascular disease, and neurological conditions. So now that we know what DNA methylation is and epigenetics at a high level, CHRISTELLE will take us through the next section.
Thanks, Poonam. So in order to explain the several benefits and opportunities of epigenetics in life insurance, let's make use of Popeye, a wisecracking cartoon sailor who gained superhuman strength after ingesting an always handy can of spinach, as an example of someone that will be taken through the life insurance process. So after he and Olive Oil got married, he decided to take out life insurance in order to protect himself or in order to protect Olive if anything were to happen to him. So it will then have the following steps. So at application stage, the life insurer will send Popeye an epigenetic testing kit, which will allow him to collect a saliva sample, and this will then be sent back to the insurer or to a lab for testing. And because this is collected with a non-invasive saliva testing kit, what this means is it actually improves his customer experience because it's not collected, like it's not a blood or a urine sample that's collected by paramedical nurses. And also a lot of the questions that was previously included in the underwriting questionnaire, like your age and gender, smoking status, etc., can now actually also be obtained from this epigenetic testing kit. So the underwriting questionnaire can potentially be shortened to allow for this as well. And it's important to note here that genetic and epigenetic tests are different. And you don't have to carry out a genetic test in order to carry out an epigenetic test. And the implications of this will be explained in a bit more detail later in the presentation. The life insurer will then make use of this to determine his biological age, which refers to how old the cells in his body are. His biological age might then actually be higher than his chronological age, which leads to age acceleration because he is a smoker, but it might actually also be lower than his chronological age because of his relatively healthy diet, because he loves spinach so much. And this will lead to age deceleration, meaning that his biological health or his cellular health is actually healthier than his chronological age. The life insurer will then make use of this information to provide Popeye with an epigenetic or a longevity report. And examples of what can be included in this report is a comparison of his biological and his chronological age, where the aim is for your biological age to be lower than your chronological age, because this then implies that you're healthier than your chronological age. His delta age, which is basically the difference between his chronological age and his biological age. Different measures such as your metabolic score, your cardiovascular score, inflammation score, and your indulgence score, with different approaches on how you can actually improve these if it's not necessarily on track. And your epimetabolic index, which is just a measurement based on DNA methylation, which has been proven to be associated with metabolic disorders. And what can also be included is different steps that you can take to reduce, what can you reduce or improve on to actually improve your biological health, with examples under each. What kind of exercises can you do under physical activity, or what kind of food can you eat? And scientific reasons can also be provided to explain why the different steps are actually important. For example, an organic whole food diet has been scientifically proven to not only maximize the antioxidant potential of your cells, but to also reduce or eliminate some harmful toxins entering your bloodstream. So what this then means for Popeye is because an epigenetic test, like Pina mentioned, can actually accurately measure your long-term smoking exposure, even if he stopped smoking before applying for life insurance, or if he attempted to hide the fact that he is a smoker from the life insurer. The epigenetic test will actually be able to take this into account at the application stage. And this is a major benefit of making use of epigenetics for underwriting, because the current underwriting approach is just to ask the policyholder whether or not he is a smoker or not. And it doesn't take historic smoking status into account. And it also therefore heavily relies on policyholder disclosure. This therefore leads to more accurate underwriting. If the life insurer then accepts Popeye's health risk, they will then charge a premium that is commensurate with his health risk. So they will charge a premium that's relatively higher because of his smoking status, but they can also reduce the premium to allow for his relatively healthy diet and his superhuman strength. After a couple of years, Popeye then takes out another epigenetic test, and the last couple of years he actually followed the epigenetic report suggestions on how he can live a healthier life. And because of this, his biological age increased by less than his chronological age, meaning that the suggestions actually worked. And because of this, it allows the life insurer to manage the policy over the long term. And the life insurer can then provide Popeye with different discounts and rebates. So they can, for example, provide him with rebates of some of the premiums that he paid over the last couple of years as an incentive for him to live healthier. And if you guys have any questions about that, I know in the next session there will be a debate about the benefits of it. And so as you guys can see in the scenario, the utilization of epigenetics in life insurance not only benefits the life insurer by allowing them to underwrite and price and manage the policy better over the long term, and thereby reducing claims costs and associated expenses over the long term, but it also benefits Popeye or the policyholder by incentivizing them to live healthier and also reducing the premiums in the long run. So 2 US-based life insurance companies that have started to make use of epigenetics are Usurance and Foxo Life. So like using a price comparison site, consumers can make use of Usurance, where before applying for life insurance, consumers are encouraged to carry out an epigenetic test, which is then used to determine your biological age, and the Usurance then provides you with a longevity report, and the products that they make available to you will then be based on your biological age. And with Foxo Life, it's a bit different. So they only provide you with a longevity report after your policy has been approved. So what's important to note with Foxo Life, they provide you with this so that you can actually live healthier afterwards, so they don't actually use it in underwriting at all. It's more to assist the policyholders to know more about their cellular or biological health. So if we assume for a moment that epigenetic tests are commercialized in South Africa, so if individuals are able to carry out epigenetic tests by non-traditional means, through direct consumer tests, for example, then they will be able to find information about their epigenetic health or higher disease risk or mortality risk without the life insurer actually knowing about it and finding out about it from medical tests. And this information asymmetry will then lead to increased anti-selection because the consumers with higher disease or mortality risk are then more likely to apply for life insurance or apply for life insurance at higher amounts. and the life insurer will not be able to assess these higher risks accurately. And this is a major benefit, of making use of epigenetics, and a big reason why life insurers might want to use epigenetics at the underwriting stage in order to protect themselves from this information asymmetry and anti-selection. But before life insurers make use of epigenetic tests, they need to evaluate these epigenetic tests. And there is a widely accepted evaluation framework that is used to evaluate clinical tests that can also be used here, and it's grouped into 3 different headings. The first of which is analytical validity, and the questions here to ask are, how accurate are epigenetic tests? So if I were to take the exact same test twice on the same day, will it actually determine the same biological age? Or if 2 different labs were to test the same sample, will they actually determine the same biological age? And like Poonam mentioned earlier in the presentation, your biological age is determined by an epigenetic clock. And for me to explain this heading a bit better, I just want to take you through how epigenetic clocks have developed over time. So initially, they called it first generation clocks, and these were more focused on determining someone's chronological age, and they relied on certain regions on top of your DNA, and these regions showed strong correlation with your chronological age, and the most popular ones were the Horvath and the Annam clocks. And after the first generation clocks, the second generation clocks developed from there, but they are more focused on determining your biological age compared to your chronological age. And they do this by feature selection, where they make use of a wider range of sites or DNA methylation sites on your DNA compared to the more focused approach of the first generation clocks. And they also make use of biological and health information. So it makes use of information about your health and diseases and your physiological or cellular health in order to determine your biological age. And the 2 most popular or well-known ones are pheno age and grim age. And as can be seen here, the epigenetic clocks have actually developed a lot over time. And in order for life insurers to make use of this, they need to determine which epigenetic clocks they will make use of. So which epigenetic clocks actually can be used accurately or reliably for underwriting and pricing purposes. So the next heading is clinical validity, where the questions to ask under clinical validity is whether biological age is actually correlated with your disease or mortality risk. So is it actually a better estimator of your disease or mortality risk compared to your chronological age? But is it actually a good predictor? So does it have predictive values? So of the people flagged with epigenetic markers of interest, how many actually, developed the diseases? And then the last one relates to clinical utility. So with clinical utility, it's about whether this will actually provide information that's useful to the consumer or to the policyholder. And like we mentioned throughout the presentation, the life insurer will be able to provide the policyholder with an epigenetic or a longevity report, which can actually provide them with a lot of information that will be able to help them to live a longer, healthier life. And from these, the clinical validity will probably be the most difficult one to prove, because it will rely on a lot of clinical tests and a lot of samples that need to be carried out in order for it to actually be proven as clinically valid. And a lot of tests will actually need to be carried out to make sure that epigenetic tests actually fall under all 3 and can actually accurately and reliably measure your biological age, and that it is a good measure of your disease risk or mortality risk.
Thanks, Christelle. So while life insurers are mainly concerned with accurate underwriting and pricing, there's little room for underwriting in the medical scheme industry because of the regulatory landscape within which we operate. So because we don't collect information like smoking status for underwriting purposes, this information is also lost for the purpose of risk management. And so if we had epigenetic tests that met all of the criteria in the previous framework that Christelle shared, and we could supply these tests to members, we could collect back this lost information in a very simple way. This would then help us with something called population risk management. So in this simple example here, we've separated the population into 3 groups. At the primary level, we're interested in how to prevent any abnormal DNA methylation. So when I say abnormal DNA methylation, I'm referring to those 2 scenarios that I gave earlier, the hypo, too much methylation, and hypo, too little methylation, and hyper, too much methylation. At the secondary level, we're interested in how to reverse any existing abnormal methylation that's picked up in an epigenetic test. And at the tertiary level, these are patients who are too sick for us to reverse their abnormal methylation. So how can epigenetic tests aid in treatment planning? At the primary level, this is really about prevention, and this is best done through the use of preventative care, wellness, and rewards programs to encourage healthy behaviors. Because someone doesn't have any abnormal methylation when they do the test, there's nothing you can really tell them aside from continue doing what you're doing, which is doing healthy behaviors like healthy diets, physical activity, managing their stress, etc. However, if epigenetic tests are used in health risk assessments, this will help with early detection of abnormal DNA methylation. And this could help us manage patients much earlier before their disease risk develops. There's something called methyl nutrients, and these are basically your B vitamins that help with the healthy methylation process. So if there's deficiencies in this area, it would indicate a need to modify diet. Interestingly, research shows that the use of vitamin supplements on methylation is inconclusive. So we're better off trying to encourage changes to diet rather than funding vitamin benefits. Although these vitamin benefits are marketable, we get a better return on our investment if we can redistribute this money towards subsidizing healthy food purchases. When it comes to physical activity, a lot of research has shown that physical activity and the intensity and rewarding the intensity of that physical activity has good health outcomes. Early childhood stresses have been linked to the development of psychiatric disorders later in life, and we know that stress is a risk for cardiovascular disease. And so if we can better equip our members and provide them with tools like teaching them about the stress cycle, meditation, funding therapy, then it begs the question, can we curb the rise in mental health prevalence that we're seeing on our medical schemes? And at the tertiary level, epigenetic biomarkers have been shown to enhance the prediction of survival in cancer patients over and above existing prognostic measures. And so this has some application in terms of resource allocation. Currently, access to very expensive drugs are done through the meeting of certain clinical criteria and the use of doctor motivations, which can sometimes be subjective. However, including an epigenetic test in that process will add an objective measure which will help with resource allocation decisions. So now we know that the use of epigenetic tests have serious implications in terms of your ethical, legal, and social implications. And so Christelle's going to discuss that in more detail in the next slides.
Thanks, Poonam. So the first one that I want to touch on is actuarial fairness, where this relates to individuals with similar health risk levels that need to be treated similarly. So we don't want policyholders that are higher risk to be paying the same premiums as policyholders with lower risk. And the question here becomes whether with epigenetic tests whether there's actually a proven correlation between your biological age and your health outcomes or your disease risk. So has this actually been scientifically validated? And we want to know whether it is seen as prudent or fair to make use of epigenetic tests. And without knowing whether it's scientifically valid or whether there is a proven correlation, we can't actually say that it's actually fair to make use of epigenetic tests in life insurance. The next one is about informed consent. So individuals will need to provide informed consent to the life insurance company in order for the insurance company to carry out epigenetic tests, or for them to make use of epigenetic tests that were carried out previously. And there might be some concerns around how informed this consent actually is, because there might be some confusion around the differences between genetic and epigenetic tests. The epigenetic data can also be seen as very private, and this might be used against an individual or a policyholder during the underwriting process. And depending on what the life insurer wants to do with the epigenetic data, this might actually violate the POPI Act. And the life insurer might also discriminate against the policyholder based on their epigenetic profiles, either charging higher premiums or denying cover for individuals with higher epigenetic or disease risks. And the last one is around legislation or regulation. So ASISA provides guidance around genetic testing, and they mention two things that I just want to mention here too. The first is that they said that a life insurer is not allowed to require that an individual carry out a genetic test at the application stage, and a life insurer is also not allowed to ask for a previously carried out genetic test without the policyholder giving their informed consent. But the question here becomes, is epigenetics sufficiently different from genetics to not be included in this? You know, because your epigenetics actually changes over your lifetime, and because you have more control over your epigenetics compared to your genetics. And it's not just static information that you receive from your parents at birth. Does this mean that epigenetics is different enough for it to be seen as fair to make use of epigenetics during the underwriting process? Or because epigenetics is still based on genetics to some extent, will it be seen as actually unfair to make use of epigenetics? Then, apart from the ethical, legal, and social implications, there are also some other constraints or concerns when we want to implement epigenetics in South Africa. So, it will require significant investment in research and investment and expertise. You know, the underwriting processes, pricing processes, a lot of the models will need to be updated to actually allow for epigenetics in life insurance. And this will be very time consuming and can be very expensive. And because epigenetic tests will need to be carried out not only at application stage, but throughout the policy term, because your epigenetics can actually change over your life, this can also be very expensive. So, especially because it needs to be carried out for every individual then. And currently, most of the epigenetic tests that are carried out are completed in the US and the UK, where it's about $300 US or 250 pounds on average. So at the moment, it's still quite expensive to carry it out. And also with these tests, because it's mostly carried out in the UK or the US, the tests are mostly completed on European or US populations, which doesn't necessarily make it that appropriate for the African or the South African population in general. So a lot of epigenetic tests and a lot of research will still need to be completed in South Africa to make it more appropriate for us. And then the last point to mention, or that I just want to mention, is about the fact that epigenetic tests provide very nuanced or intricate data, and it can be very complex to interpret. And the relationship between your biological age, your biological health, and your disease risk is still being investigated. And because it's so complex, underwriters will need to be educated on actually how to interpret this data or this information in order to accurately apply it in the underwriting process. So if any one of you are more interested in epigenetics, there are a couple of papers that you can go and read or videos that you can go and watch. Ones that I enjoyed a lot or that helped a lot is a white paper on epigenetics by the Society of Actuaries, and Dr. Daniel D. Zimmerman also gave a presentation on epigenetics as well, if anyone is interested in that. So now that, and also with epigenetics is not necessarily the answer, but it might be a possible future scenario that can be incorporated into the current underwriting processes or be used in addition to current risk management systems. So let's embrace the hidden key of epigenetics, unlocking a future where health and insurance risk are truly personalized and where each individual can shape their own epigenetic destiny. Thank you.
Thank you, CHRISTELLE and Poonam. We'll now take any questions from the floor, if there are any. If not, we'll move on to some questions from the app. I think you did mention this a little bit, but both Riman and Marilise ask, so in terms of costing, what would the epigenetic kits cost in comparison to any other tests?
Yeah, so like CHRISTELLE mentioned, they're actually quite expensive at the moment. But like I mentioned earlier, it's an emerging technology, and we know with new technologies, they do tend to get cheaper, the longer they're around. So at the moment, it's very expensive, and we know it's like prohibitively expensive to use in the underwriting process. But I think in future, it would be much more affordable, especially if it's commercialized in South Africa. At the moment in South Africa, there's no labs that do epigenetic tests. So if you did want your epigenetic results, you need to send your saliva swab to either the US or the UK, which, doesn't quite make sense at the moment.
Thank you so much. Someone here is asking what's an appropriate frequency to do these tests for the purposes of life underwriting?
Sorry, can you maybe repeat the question?
An appropriate frequency of doing the tests.
So I think it would be, at the moment in my mind, it would be about 10 years. It does take a while for your epigenetic changes to change in response to changes in your lifestyle behavior. So maybe I would say 5 to 10 years. The scenario that CHRISTELLE gave was, I think, Popeye being underwritten, getting his policy, and then, 5 years later doing another epigenetic test. So this does mean that epigenetic tests would need to be ongoing throughout the lifetime of a policyholder.
Cool. And then John asks, would there be a requirement to involve a doctor in the communication of epigenetic results, compared with the experience of customers who test positive for HIV?
Yes, definitely. So at the moment when you do genetic testing, so sequencing your actual genome, that also requires a genetic counselor to actually take you through the results and interpret it for you. In a similar way, that will need to be done with epigenetic tests.
Thank you. We have a question in the room.
If we've sent our DNA on one of those DNA testing, when we were in Europe for DNA testing profiling, can that same DNA test be used for this epigenetics, or would we need to do a separate test for that epigenetics?
Yeah, it would be a separate test because epigenetic testing doesn't require you to actually sequence your genome. So it's looking for something completely different to the actual A, G, C's, and T's in your genome. So it'd be a different test. Yeah.
Thank you.
And then Peter asked, does some information from epigenetics reveal underlying genetics and so implicitly involve discrimination?
So there are still some concerns around that. It doesn't sound like they completely know whether epigenetic tests are completely different from genetics. So it sounds like there are some concerns around the fact that some of the tests might overlap, and I think they are busy carrying out or still doing a lot of testing on it. But I think, I think it is probably very different.
Yeah, so epigenetic changes don't alter your DNA sequence at all. So what you're looking for in an epigenetic test is completely different.
So they just need to make sure that they make use of the correct information and apply it correctly or estimate it correctly.
Thank you. There's a question here from Shreya who says, mental health conditions are becoming more prevalent and common in this day and age. Can epigenetics also be used to predict and manage mental health conditions, or is it limited to physical health?
So it would relate to the abnormal DNA methylation. So it depends where you find that in your DNA sequence. Because in some places it's indicators for cardiovascular disease, in other places it's indicators for metabolic disease. That's why, that scenario that Foxo Life gives you is a metabolic score, an inflammation score, a cardiovascular score, and I think an indulgence score, because you can tell distinctly based on different places in your DNA what those methylation patterns mean for you in terms of those particular risk factors. So at the moment, I don't think there's a reliable score you can get for mental health prevalence, but we know that stress does cause an impact, stress, anxiety, depression, etc. It does cause an impact on the development of abnormal DNA methylation.
So you've mentioned that if you take protective factors to, it's a bit weird to hear my own voice. Taking protective factors to, making changes to a more healthy lifestyle can lead to age deceleration. Is there also evidence that, those making those changes could, reverse that, age reversal?
So there's been a lot of studies done on smoking especially. So they've seen, for example, that if someone stops smoking and then after a couple of years, their biological health actually improved a lot, and that it can later on be compared to someone that never smoked. But it does take a couple of years. So most of those studies, of age acceleration and deceleration are mostly done in terms of smoking to show how different factors can be reversible and how your age acceleration or age deceleration differs over time.
Yeah, and maybe just to add that all epigenetic changes aren't reversible. Some of them are, not all of them.
Sorry, I've got another question. So, obviously, so smoking is, seems like a significant, factor in, age acceleration. But let's say if you are a smoker, but, you eat healthy and, you exercise, you meditate, etc. Does that offset the negative impact of smoking?
Can I choose not to comment on that?
No, that's a very good question.
I've actually lost my train of thought now. So I think our bodies are very complex. We have very different biological processes going on at the same time. And like CHRISTELLE said, epigenetics is just one of those biological processes. You've got your gut microbiome, etc., all of that, and it's all integrated. So it's a very complex system, And so I don't think it's very easy to say, well, if I increase this and decrease that, I'm going to get to a net zero, place. I think even though we know a lot, there's still a lot about the workings of the body that we don't know and are still discovering.
Anonymous on the app asks, how would the age calculated from methylation, biological age, differ from a discovery age?
Discovery age. I'm assuming they meant vitality age. So like the question asks, it's more specific and it's more personalized because it's based on your own DNA methylation rather than based on some generic, score that's used for everybody. It is very different because it's a lot more scientific.
Yeah, the only thing is because it's more scientific, it's more expensive to carry out now. So the cost and the benefit of it will need to be compared.
We have a question in the room.
So you said back here. You said the epigenetics has a correlation to the cancer risk. Is the reverse true as well? That if you've had cancer, would that also sort of have an impact? Just sort of thinking in terms of sort of applicability and sort of links to right to be forgotten or right to forget, sort of the European sort of cancer risk sort of legislation that's going on at the moment.
That's a very interesting question. I actually don't know if cancer causes abnormal DNA methylation, but there's a lot of research done in terms of medicines used for cancer patients, and there's methylation inhibitor drugs that have been developed for specific cancers. So, yeah, I'm not sure the answer to that question. It was a very good question.
Thank you. There's another question here online that says, with technological improvements, we're getting better and better at predicting mortality. Taken to the extreme, one day we might be able to pinpoint an individual's exact time of death. Where do we draw the line between risk pooling and risk discrimination?
So I think we're doing, in the way underwriting is done at the moment, I think a lot of it is getting more and more personalized as we, go forward in time. And there is the question about, and I think it's something that's actually going to be discussed in the next debate also. There's a question that, yes, you give discounts or rebates to, healthy people, but once they get sick, then what do you do? Do you take away those discounts and then what happens? Are you actually creating an underclass of policyholders who can't really access certain levels of benefits because of these epigenetic tests? And that's why the ethical implications are so important for us to focus on before we actually start using these tests.
And it probably also depends on what you want to use the information for, or whether you want it's only to benefit the insurer or also to benefit the policyholders. Like, I don't know if I'll want to know exactly when I'm going to die one day. Like if it's only to benefit the insurer, then that's probably where you draw the line. I don't know.
There's another question online that says, how do you foresee the applicability and use of epigenetics in critical illness and disability insurance products?
So, because it can to an extent also, or it's correlated with your disease risk as well, it can also be used there to an extent. So it can be used, for example, like POONAM expanded on a bit, to measure like your cancer risk, for example. So it can be used to better measure your disease risk as well. That can then also be used in the pricing for critical illness.
And then another question says, while many studies have focused on the impact of smoking, have there been any studies done that focus on the prevention and management of chronic diseases?
Yeah. So like I mentioned, the chronic diseases, they're actually on the screen here. So it's mainly around cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease, neurological diseases, and cancer. So those are the four main areas of chronic disease that have been studied. So a lot has been happening in the space of the management of those particular patients, and the example I gave earlier was in terms of particular drugs being developed, methylation inhibitors for cancer patients. On the prevention side, like I mentioned earlier, it's mainly about, the preventative care, wellness, and rewards programs to really encourage the healthy behaviors that prevent any abnormal DNA methylation from actually occurring.
Thank you. I think this next attendee wants to know about supplementation. Is there any supplementation one can take to reduce, increase, or stabilize methylation?
Not that I know of, no.
Another person says that are the epigenetic or biological ages of females typically 5 to 6 years less than that of males, consistent with the lower mortality we observe?
I'm not sure where that came from. That number came from, not to my knowledge.
It's something we can look into, but I haven't heard of that.
Are they suggesting that females are healthier on average than men?
There's another question, or Shreya also asks that, is there an opportunity for fraud with these type of tests?
There might be, but the fact that you can determine someone's age and gender, for example, from these tests makes it a bit more difficult. So I know initially when we started looking into this, a lot of people were like, but you can just, yes, do it on someone else, but you'll be able to determine the person's chronological age and gender, etc., from the test. So it's not like I can go home and do this on my brother or my dad, yeah, which makes fraud a bit more difficult.
We have a question right here up front.
Thanks very much, a great paper. First of all, vitality age is scientific.
I heard the murmur when I said that.
No problem. I wanted to just ask, because you're talking about applying the results to things like population health management. So I wanted to know whether the results, first of all, the question is are the results of that test, so say hypermethylation, always driven entirely by controllable factors? And are we able to tease out if not, are we able to tease out what portion is driven by controllable factors? Because I guess uncontrollable stuff, even environmental factors, will raise issues around fairness. And then where the results are driven by controllable factors, are you able to tease out what the underlying driver is? So in the Popeye case, that the issue is smoking and not diet, so that then the intervention is correct.
Thanks. Yeah, so like we said, epigenetics is really an emerging science, and not enough is known about the individual pieces right now. Yes, we can see correlations between diet and exercise and stress, etc. But there are uncontrollable factors, like you mentioned, like the environment. If there's pollutants and toxins, especially with climate change, changing, that in your environment, that's definitely something you can't control, but will have an impact on your body. So yeah, I completely agree with you, but I think it's a bit too early for us to be able to tease out those individual factors. I think at the moment it's more general associations at a higher level with things like diet and physical activity and stress.
But I think some of the components, like smoking, for example, they measure certain epigenetic markers, or with smoking at least, it refers to certain epigenetic markers that they test. So I think that's kind of how they can determine smoking at least and what impact smoking has on your health.
Thank you so much, Christelle and Poonam. I think that was quite interesting, and epigenetics is really something that's, I think we should look forward to, and I think that really Popeye really sees value in it. Moving on to our next concurrent session.